Hello, I'm Pedro Mora with Pacific Media. And now, Pull-In. Today we present Rex Wyler, better known as the founder of Greenpeace. He warns us of a pending ecological catastrophe. Here is Rex.
I think if we look at human civilization today, we can see plenty of things to be concerned about. Population growth, environmental, with the massive social movements of the past, why do we not have a more egalitarian culture? With the massive women's movement of the past, why do we still have a primarily patriarchal culture? With the massive environmental movement of the past 3 or 4 decades, we have a more deteriorated environment today than we did 40 years ago. What's wrong? And I think as those of us interested in social movements and social change have to ask ourselves the very difficult questions. Are we approaching this properly? Are we asking the right questions? Do we understand what the situation is that we are in? We live on a finite planet, and it does have limits. And it has more than limits. It has patterns of evolution, biological and physical patterns, which we may call rules or laws of nature. And we don't get to decide what those are. Our social movements don't get to decide what those are. We can have a more democratic society and still be destroying the planet. Cuba is an interesting example because Cuba is a society that has minimal environmental damage compared to most nations in the world. So there is a correlation between modest living, modest lifestyles, and environmental sustainability. So if we want to actually have an environmentally sustainable society, we need to actually have less consumption. And I'm going to explain a little bit about why I believe that is. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. If we look at this, this is the CO2 in the atmosphere up to 2000, and then we take this this small piece here and blow it up here, and you can see this is the growth of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which is causing global warming. Now, we have had the question is, we've had an environmental movement all this time, but there's nowhere in this chart that we can see that we've had an impact on this increase of CO2 in our atmosphere. Now, if you look at this, over 100 years ago, almost 120 years ago, Svante Arrhenius in Europe predicted global warming based on the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere simply from burning coal and wood in Europe over 100 years ago. Scientists knew that CO2 in the atmosphere acts as a greenhouse gas, that it will trap heat in the earth. And Svante Arrhenius predicted global warming back here. Ironically, he thought, well, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea because warmer days, it's not going to matter. But he didn't really, he at that point hadn't really thought the whole thing through. Now we know that global warming is a serious problem. It's causing acidification of the oceans, it's melting the Arctic ice and so forth. James Lovelock knew about global warming in the 1960s, and he calculated the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and he calculated the temperature rise. Greenpeace knew about it in the 70s because James Lovelock sent us the information. We had a Kyoto process started in about 1991. Kyoto was adopted in about 2000. Al Gore's film, everybody knows about it. Zero impact. Zero impact. The up and down on this chart is seasonal CO2 in the atmosphere, but you can see where this chart's going. So we have to ask our questions as a society. We have the science, we've got the social movement, we've got the environmental movement, we've got films, we've got political process, we're getting together at the international level. Zero impact. And in fact, the CO2 in the atmosphere is growing faster, not slower, than it was 40 years ago. We have a problem, is that this economy that we're building regardless of our social structure and regardless of how fairly we share the benefits of that economy, this economy that we're building it on a living thing, in a living ecosystem. I like to remind people that we don't actually live on the earth. We don't live on the environment, on the ecosystem. We live in it, inside of it. We are a part of it. We live inside a living thing. The ecosystem is a living thing, a living set of processes, and we live inside of it. We are one piece of that process. We do not get to reinvent or redefine the laws of thermodynamics or the laws of biology or the laws of nature. We have to discover these and discover what they are. Everything we do, we're doing inside this ecosystem. Now this is an example because this is a good example because this is a story about what happens with one species on an island, so it's isolated. We can look at it. During the war, during World War II, the United States government brought 29 reindeer to St. Matthew's Island because they thought the soldiers on the island would need the reindeer for food. The war ended, they didn't need the island, they didn't need the reindeer, they left, and they left 29 reindeer on the island. So these reindeer had the run of St. Matthew's Island, and they went around and munching the grass and the lichen, and they just had a ball, and the population grew. Now, the biologists who studied this case figured that the island might have been able to sustain about 2,000 reindeer, or maybe even a little bit more. So this K refers to what we call carrying capacity. We use the symbol K for carrying capacity. That's the capacity of that ecosystem to sustain life. So that ecosystem could have sustained 2,000 reindeer. But as the reindeer grew, they reduced that capacity. They blew right past it. They grew to a number of 6,000 reindeer, and in one winter, they died back from 6,000 reindeer to 42. They just ate themselves out of a home. Now, the question is, are we smarter than the reindeer? Well, here's the Easter Island example. Humans did the same thing on Easter Island. They grew from, you can see the population growth, and they begin to deteriorate. Now again, on Easter Island, the biologists have assumed that the island, have estimated the island could have sustained a couple thousand people, likely. But here's what happened on Easter Island. They cut down all the trees to roll these giant stones around. But the trees not only provided them with food from the forest and a place for other species to live, which they also ate, but the trees also allowed them to make these giant dugout canoes, which they would take out beyond the surf so they could go deep sea fishing. Well, when they cut down all the large trees, they could no longer make these giant canoes. They could no longer get outside the surf, so they fished out their little lagoon. They wiped out their forests. They wiped out the habitat for all the other species, and you can see their population. You can see in that top graph. Now, this graph down here shows the decline of the forest over that period of time. Now, what's interesting is when the forest starts to decline, is very early. You see that little diamond up at the top. Very early in that growth curve. It didn't take thousands of people on Easter Island to begin to deteriorate that ecosystem. The ecosystem began to deteriorate, as our global ecosystem has, very early in the growth curve. They grew to 7,000 or 8,000 people. Again, about 3 times, like the reindeer, about 3 times past the capacity of the island. So here's another important thing for us to understand. A society can grow way beyond the capacity of its habitat before it actually collapses. And it can seem like everything's just cooking along just fine, as it does right now. Bill Reese out at UBC estimates that we're at about 50% overshoot right now. So that would mean, according to Bill Reese, we're, by the way, as we grow, the capacity of the planet, every time we reduce the forest, we reduce the fish in the ocean, acid in the ocean, reduce the aquifers, all of these things that we're doing is reducing the capacity. So we've already blown past that green line. We're already probably around 50% or more. Some people say as much as 100% overshoot. But it can still seem like everything's fine. So for those of us who are paying attention, we know everything is not fine. But for the rest of the people out there in the world who aren't necessarily paying attention, they go to their job, they come home, they got enough money, everything may seem fine. Here's the problem. We have an economic system that believes it can grow because the economic system produces products which it sells to the consumers. The households spend the money goes back to the companies can do more production, and this goes round and round and we can grow our economy. But here, and you will see a chart like this in virtually every beginning, fundamental, elementary economics book, Economics 101, you will see a chart like this. Now here's the question, where's the environment? This economic system exists inside a living ecosystem. Where is it? Well, here's our problem. What the economics books do not account for is that every economic system has resource inputs. Oh, and by the way, those resource inputs are finite. And every economic system has waste. And so we have sinks for our waste, which includes the atmosphere where we're dumping our CO2, and in the rivers where we're dumping our toxic pollution, and the dump at Vancouver, the Vancouver dump that we're taking now out of town up to Cache Creek and so forth. All of these things are finite. But you don't find this chart in the economics books. What we're not accounting for is throughput, the amount of stuff that goes through our economy. Regardless of how we share it, whether we share it equitably or whether we don't. Now here's just an example of the growth curves of consumption. You see the rivers, the number of rivers we've dammed, water use, fertilizer, McDonald's restaurants, telephones, and you can see that in the 20th and 21st century, all of these curves are sweeping up. Now these curves is not just a mathematical game here. These curves represent real stuff. Communications, telephones. This represents copper, iron, silver, rare earth metals, all the stuff that they make our cell phones out of. That comes out of the earth. So that's not just a mathematical formula there. That represents real stuff that comes out of the earth. Here's an interesting paper consumption. Remember computers were going to save paper? Didn't happen. Why didn't computers save paper? They're more efficient. Well, this is something we need to learn about efficiency. Efficiency does not save resources. It never has. Gibbons figured this out during in the 18th century. Figured out that when the coal burning machines became more efficient, we burned more coal, not less. Why? Because when the machines became more efficient, we made more machines, we used more machines, we burned more coal. Computers created more ways to use paper, and even though in some isolated cases computers might have saved paper here and there, overall computers sped up the use of paper. We now use 5 times as much paper as we did in 1960 at the dawn of the computer age. Now, if you take all these sweeping indicators, these resources, whether it's temperature, population, CO2 in the atmosphere, loss of forests, fisheries, copper, cement, oil, all of this stuff that we're using, and all of these curves are sweeping up. Now, you've heard the expression that you can't add apples and oranges. Actually, you can. You just have to give them a new name, like fruit. So you actually can add up all of these functions, these sweeping curves, and you get something like this. You get an exponentially growing curve of consumption. And I'm going from 1750, sort of the dawn of the industrial era, and you can see this sweeping curve of consumption. Now this is irregardless, once again, of how we organize our societies. This is whether we are sharing, or whether we're hoarding, or whether we have royalties, or whether we have egalitarian state, or women's rights, or civil rights, or anything. This is our consumption. Now if you go back to 1750, the dawn of the industrial era, and you track this consumption, which is growing at about 3.5% per year, that means it's doubling every 20 years. Our consumption doubles every 20 years. Think of 3.5% growth sounds small, but you have to understand, a 3.5% exponential growth is a doubling every 20 years. The way you figure this out is you divide the percentage growth into 70. So if you have a 2% growth, if you have a 2% annual growth in population, for example, you divide that into 70, that means you're going to double population every 35 years. These, by the way, are things worth knowing. If we want to be, if you want to understand ecology, there's a few of these things that's important to know. Understand what ecological growth actually means. So, between 1750 and 1950, that means if with 20-year doubling over 200 years, is that right? 200 years. So our throughput in 1950 was 1,000 times. The human throughput in 1950 was 1,000 times 1750. But look what happens. In 20 years, it's 2,000 times. In another 20 years, it's 4,000 times. Now, here's something interesting. When you have an exponentially growing number, in one doubling time, so between 1970 and 1990, we used as much stuff, we pulled as much resources out of the earth, trees, fish, metal, copper, stuff, out of the earth, as we did in the entire history back to 1750 to 1970. Do you understand what I'm saying? And you don't have to do the calculus to understand it. You can eyeball it. You can see it with your eyes. This little shape here is actually almost equal, but slightly bigger than this yellow shape here. So we did it again. We doubled again. Now we're using 8,000 times as much stuff. Now the question is, can we keep doing this? In the meantime, we've degraded this K, the carrying capacity has been reduced because we've cut down half the forests on the planet. We've lost species. The oceans are acidic. We've drained the aquifers. We're lopping off mountaintops. We're heating up the atmosphere. That's dropping the capacity of the planet, and now we've blown past it. We've blown past the carrying capacity. Human throughput. When I made this graph a couple of years ago, it was Bill Reese out of UBC estimated 30% overshoot. He now says 50%. And those of us who live in Canada, and I'm sure we're all very thankful and grateful that we live in such a nice place, but we're among the top consumers on the planet. And almost everybody on the planet wants more. So we have this push to consume more. But it's population and consumption together. The impact on the Earth is the population times the average consumption. And the average consumption is going up. Now the question is, can we just keep going at 3.5% consumption? Well, we can go for quite a ways. We saw that example with people on Easter Island. We saw the example of the reindeer. But we know that eventually in that direction, we will crash. Now, I put this up here because what if we do all these things. What if we build Priuses and we don't use as much oil? Or what if we take out our garbage? Or what if we recycle some things? Or, what if we reduced our growth of consumption from 3.5% to 1%? This would be unprecedented in human history, that we were able to reduce our growth of consumption by 1/3 or more. Even so, growing at 1%, we're going to double every 70 years. It's not going to happen that way. We're not going to take these little baby steps and do slightly better. You've heard the term to be more sustainable. Well, sustainability is like getting the ferry. Either you make it or you don't. If you miss it, you miss it. Being closer to sustainable doesn't make you sustainable. So it means you can maybe last a little longer. But if we really want to be sustainable, we have to consume at a level below this carrying capacity. And there's two really obvious things here. One, we need to stop destroying the Earth. We need to stop destroying the capacity. We need to stop losing forests and gaining desert. We need to shrink the desert and grow the forest. And we need to reduce the acidity of the oceans and reduce the heat in the atmosphere and so forth. Otherwise, like all these other things, I call it the Wyly Coyote scenarios, we're just going to end up, out over thin air with no real wealth below us to support our communities. So, for me, when I look into the future, and I'm asking the question, we as a society, how do we create a fair society and a pleasant lifestyle for our children, our grandchildren, and generations in the future? I realize I don't want to end up here. I don't want to end up in this chaos. I want my children, I don't care if my children have to live a more modest lifestyle. I think they will have to live a more modest lifestyle. I just don't want them to live in chaos, because the further we go out on these delusional paths, the larger the crash. So what we have to do is we have to restore the earth, stop destroying the earth for one thing, and restore the earth. Make sure that our forests are growing, that the fish in the seas are growing, and so forth. And then we have to find a level of consumption that is below the capacity of the earth. And in biological terms, in evolutionary terms, that is the only way to survive. If the wolves overpopulate in the forest and they kill all the deer, the wolves die down. If the deer overpopulate, the deer die down. There are no examples in nature of endless growth. None. Now, so here's my proposal. We have to figure out, as a part of our discussion of social equity and fairness and ecology and sustainability, we have to find a way back down to a lower level of consumption. Now that might, to some people, that is frightening and kind of counterintuitive. Do we really have to have less stuff? I thought we were all trying to make everybody richer. But the problem is that the earth can only provide so much. So we have to find this lower lifestyle. Now, here's the interesting thing to me. We're not talking, people say, oh, what are you saying? We all go back and live in the caves? Well, no, we're not talking about living in the caves. We're talking about living the average consumption maybe of the 1950s, the 1930s or 40s or 50s. We're not talking about going back to the caves. We're just talking about the fact that we can't necessarily all have private automobiles, and everybody has a detached house, and some people have private jets, and some people have 3 or 4 private jets, and people have billion-dollar yachts. We have to calm down as a species. Community gardens, I think, to me, the way this is going to go is that we're just, I'm hoping that this path to more modest lifestyles is something that will go on for many generations, and we'll just learn the things we have to learn. We'll learn how to grow food. We'll learn how to recycle things. We'll learn that happiness is not necessarily connected to stuff. And that if we want to provide a good lifestyle and equality in our communities and fairness around the world, and allow the people that are literally starving to death on the world to have a level of consumption so that they can have full and rewarding lives, we just simply have to reduce our consumption. So this is going to go right across the board throughout our discussion of social equity, is that we'll talk about here in a bit, is that when we talk about social equity, we're going to have to talk about social equity within the limits and within the parameters and the patterns of nature. Now, these are a few things that I'm suggesting we need to do. These are just my suggestions off the top of the head, and I know that most of you in this room could come up with 20 more good ones. But here's some things we need to do. We need to eliminate cars. We're not going to solve this by making Priuses and driving electric cars. We need the most efficient transportation is walking and bicycles, and beyond that is good light rail public transport. Now, there are jobs, there is economy to build. I mean, we need to build a transportation infrastructure in the Lower Mainland. There's jobs available to do that. But we can't drive it by simply by profit, by companies making lots of money. You can read these. I'm not going to read through all these, but basically we need to stabilize our population, reduce our CO2, reduce our entire throughput of matter and energy. just simply use less stuff. 100% recycling. Our building codes, for example, need to build in environmental parameters. We need to use heat pumps, better insulation. Preserve the farmland. I mean, it's insane that we're building highways across farmland in British Columbia. Preserve wilderness, less meat consumption. Meat consumption is a big demand on the environment. We're going to have sea rise over the next several generations, so we're going to need the dike. We need global education about these things, etc., etc. But the final one is important. Take care of each other. And this is where it cuts back, this is where it links back into our social equity, egalitarianism, and our social justice issues, is that, look, capitalism has created a society where we're supposedly all competing against each other. Come on, we're supposed to be communities looking after each other. You know, to me, our modern industrialism has destroyed the three things that actually keep us alive: our environment, our families, and our communities. We need to rebuild community, keep our families strong, keep our environment healthy. That's how we're going to sustain ourselves. So from an environmental point of view, and this is Arne Næss's summation. Arne Næss was one of the sort of pioneer ecologists who was one of my heroes when I was young. And he says it very simply: we can live richer lives with simpler means. And I think that's our goal, and that's my goal, and that's what I would encourage us to think about when we think about social equity, environmental justice.
Yes, the 1% elite are propagating the supremacy of economic growth, free markets, and maximizing profits, which, as Rex Wyler says, is fatally destroying our planet. But it is the 99% of people who are compliant with that capitalist agenda. If we continue to increase production, to increase the markets, to increase the economy, to increase profits, Rex Wyler says, we will soon kill our ecosystem and ourselves with it. An alternative possibility to this predicted doomsday is suggested by this booklet, Perpetual Direct Democracy, where a cultural change would shift political power from a few politicians to all of us, the 99%. A cultural evolution to save our planet is in our hands.